Hello. Welcome back to Wednesday Word. As always, thank you so much for joining me. I pray that you've enjoyed the presence of the Lord and had some time to spend in His Word this week already, and that you're ready to dive back with me into our study of the prophet Elisha. Now, last time we were actually in 2 Kings chapter 3, and we saw God miraculously provide water for the combined troops of Jehoram and the soldiers from the northern kingdom, Jehoshaphat and the soldiers from the southern kingdom, and then the king of Edom and his troops as well. And you might recall that they had moved against Moab because the king of Moab had rebelled and refused to pay tribute to the northern kingdom anymore. That was interesting. Some would argue it wasn't really a miracle. Remember, water rushed down from the hills of Edom and filled a valley, but the timing of it, according to God's prediction, it was a miracle. And then we saw those combined troops move against Edom, and they were having great success. God had said, get in there and destroy. So they had destroyed the principal cities pretty much except for Kir Hareseth, and they, even though attacked, they managed to escape. But then something shocking happened. The king of Moab, in desperation, because he could tell he wasn't winning the battle, he sacrificed his own son on the wall where both armies could see what was happening. Desperate for an idol that could do nothing for him to answer his prayer and to give victory. Remember, I told you that they believed if they were losing a battle or if things were going against them, that it was because their gods were mad. And so what a terrible thing to do. And Israel retreated. Now, we debated last week about the causes for that, what might have been the underlying reason, so I won't go back to that. We had just gone into 2 Kings chapter 4 when we actually ran out of time. So I want to go back there and pick that up so that we have a good feel for where we were. I'm going to actually reread the text from that section. It is 2 Kings chapter 4, and I will reread verses 1 through 7, and it says, Now the wife of one of the sons of the prophets cried to Elisha, Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, but the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves. And Elisha said to her, What shall I do for you? Tell me, what have you in the house? And she said, Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. Then he said, Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels and not too few. Then go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons and pour into all these vessels. And when one is full, set it aside. So she went from him and shut the door behind herself and her sons. And as she poured, they brought the vessels to her. So she pours oil as her sons bring an empty vessel and remove the full one. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, Bring me another vessel. And he said to her, There is not another. Then the oil stopped flowing. The oil didn't stop until the vessels were all full. She came and told the man of God. And he said, Go, sell the oil, and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest. Now, chapter 4 is interesting, and it will be our focus today. Chapter 4 includes 4 different, totally different, powerful miracles done by Elisha because of God's power working in him. every one of these stories not only clearly proves the power of God, by the way, the power of God that was superior to Baal, because for Elijah and Elisha, God has worked through them, trying to show the people that your idol can do nothing for you. The power rests in God. And so these miracles prove God's power, but they also illustrate spiritual truths, every one of them. So, okay, here we go. You've got this woman. She's a widow. She has two children. Some versions say children, some say sons, and some, like the New King James, mix and say one time and the other the next. We know that her husband was a son of the prophet, not a biological son of any prophet, but a part of that group or that guild of prophets that were basically being mentored by a proven and tested prophet, first by Elijah and now by Elisha. Now, we know that these sons of the prophets lived in common property because Scripture talks about they're outgrowing a location and having to have more room. We know they ate from a common table, but we also know that some of them were married and they had families, and that was an issue because your family has to have support. That's obviously. So this woman's a widow. She obviously owes money to creditors. The creditor has come and said, look, I'm going to take your children in payment for the debt. They can work off what you owe me. So, of course, she would be distressed. Now, we are not told how old these children are, these boys. Obviously, they are not grown. Grown children would have gone out and gotten a job and earned a living. They are minor children. She needs to be able to provide for her minor children. Now, the Bible's clear regarding the way widows and orphans are to be treated. Basically, God is their champion because they have lost the man who should be an earthly champion for them. And the Word makes it clear that when we show compassion and when we help widows and orphans, then we're modeling true and genuine faith, the kind that is God-honoring, the kind that reflects a real relationship with God. So, though we understand that good deeds don't save us, we also understand that because we're saved and we have a relationship with God, then the good deeds we do and the kindness we show is a reflection of His character within us. I couldn't begin to tell you how many scriptures address appropriate treatment of widows and orphans. There are so many, but let me read just a few. Exodus 22:22, you shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. Psalm 146:9, the Lord watches over the sojourners. He upholds the widows and the fatherless, but the way of the wicked He brings to ruin. James 1:27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Now, I told you last time, one of the last things we discussed, the historian Josephus. Now, I've warned many times we don't trust every source out there that we can research. But Josephus is well known and is accepted as a historian with some accuracy. He says that this widow woman was not only legitimately in need as a widow, but that she was the widow of the minor prophet Obadiah. Now, I already know there are more than 10 people in Scripture named Obadiah, and there is room for plenty of confusion. But I remind you that 1st and 2nd Kings were written shortly after Babylon made that third and final raid on Judah. Judah was left in an absolute mess. But it backs up and looks at that period approaching the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom and the destruction of Judah by Babylon. And the intention is that there would be a record of the kings, what kind of kings they were, and that it would be preserved for the children of Israel. And mixed in here with these accounts of these kings, we have these exploits of the prophets Elijah and Elisha. So if you go back and look at the time frame, the minor prophet Obadiah, when he wrote, the fact that he would have passed away, and compare that time frame to when the events of this book should have occurred, it makes sense. It does line up in terms of timing. So, okay, whether that's true or not, this widow is in dire straits. She needs help. Her husband was a godly man. That is made clear. She defends that. She talks about what kind of man he was. She would logically be distressed and worried, as any woman would in the same place. And so she takes those concerns to the prophet Elisha. Now, his response is, well, what do you want from me? And then he says to her, well, what do you already have in your house? Such a powerful lesson here, that God doesn't have to create anything new. He can take who we are, the talents we have, the resources we have, and somehow make it enough. So she tells him that all she has in her house is a jar of oil. Now, there's no doubt about it, that would have been a jar of olive oil. It could be used both for fuel and for cooking. It was, of course, the most available thing in that land that would have been able to be used for those purposes. Certainly they couldn't burn up wood. There would not be enough of that for that purpose. So she's telling him, look, here's what I have. Whether she realizes it or not, Elisha is preparing her for the miracle that is coming. He says, okay, go borrow vessels, and don't just get a few. Don't limit yourself. There are several times in Scripture where people limit themselves, whether it's how many times the ground was struck or how many jars that were empty that are borrowed. God has no limitations. Sometimes we put limitations on him. In any case, they borrow vessels. Did you notice that the woman shut the door? Now, we're going to see shutting the door and God working behind closed doors several times even today. God is not about being conspicuous for the sake of being conspicuous, but he is plenty powerful enough to do what he needs to do, and we're going to see so many examples of that today. So, okay, as I've already said, her sons bring these empty pots. She fills them up from this jar. When the pot's full, they move that away, and I'm guessing they're taking turns and they're bringing the empty pots, and pretty soon she needs another pot or container, and there's not anymore. And so the minute there is not another container, the oil stops flowing. Now, I have to remind you that women are limited in what they can do in this culture and in that part of the world and in that time frame. She's certainly not presumptuous. She does what Elisha tells her. And once she's got these full jars of oil, she returns back to him and says, what should I do now? And he says, look, sell what you need to sell to pay off the creditors and use the rest to support you and your sons. Now, think about that for a second. Logic tells us however many containers she had, it wouldn't be enough to support her all her life or her boys all their lives. It wasn't intended for that. It was intended to support them while there was not another option for that support. Truthfully, God does the miraculous to provide for us when we don't have any other option. But when we can get it for ourselves or work and earn it, that's what we're expected to do. He's going to do for us what we can't do for ourselves. So the man of God again gives her clear instructions. Remember, women were viewed as inferior, basically as property. And so he gives her direction on what to do. And he wants not only her to know, but it's clear that this story illustrates that we can depend on God. He is faithful. He will provide for us. When we are desperate and have no options, all we need to do is trust Him, be faithful, do what we can do, and I believe fully that He will reward us for our faithfulness and for the fact that we were doing the very best we could. Okay, so we've seen a miraculous multiplication, a multiplication that became provision for a widow of a godly man and the two children, the two minor children who were left behind. Now let's go. Remember, there are 4 separate miraculous situations in chapter 4 alone. Let's go to the second one. This is 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 8 through 17. And it says, one day, now some time has passed, we don't know how much, Elisha went on to Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to eat some food. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat food. And she said to her husband, behold now, I know that this is a holy man of God, who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls, and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp, so that whenever he comes to us, he can go in there. One day he came there, and he turned into the chamber and rested there. And he said to Gehazi, his servant, call this Shunammite. When he had called her, she stood before him, and he said to him, say now to her, see, you have taken all this trouble for us. What is to be done for you? In other words, you've been such a blessing to us. What can we do for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army? She answered, I dwell among my own people. And he said, what then is to be done for her? Gehazi answered, well, she has no son, and her husband is old. He said, call her. And when he had called her, she stood in the doorway, and he said, at this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son. And she said, no, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant. But the woman conceived, and she bore a son about that time the following spring, as Elisha had said to her. Now, okay, this is part 1 of a 2-part story. And it actually has 3 major components that we're going to see. Apparently, in his circuit of visiting these sites where we find the sons of the prophets. Remember, Elijah did that. Elisha does it as well. Bethel, Jericho, Gilgal, and even up in the mountains there were some. So he visits regularly. So he walks a lot, and he passes by the house of this woman and her husband a lot. They are people of means. So she is wealthy. She has a husband. In that respect, she is very different from the widow in the first story. She is not a widow at all. She is a generous woman. She's a hospitable woman. And so anytime Elisha and his servant Gehazi were in that area, she insisted that they eat there. They would be fed and provided for. And subsequently, She suggests that a room be built on the roof. That was very common. And there would be outside stairs giving separate access to that room on the roof. And it was just for Elisha and his servant. It was provided there for them. So Elisha wants to do something for her. The servant makes some suggestions, and so they call her. And Elisha doesn't want to embarrass her, so basically he kind of instructs Gehazi, who talks to her for Elisha. And she basically says, you don't need to talk to the king for me or to a commander of the army for me. She says, I'm content. I stay among my own people. I'm fine. I don't need anything. I don't have to go anywhere. I don't have to have anything more than what I have. She's basically saying, I'm asking for nothing. And anything I did for you, I did out of the willingness and the generosity of my own heart. Wow. So she's basically saying, look, you don't worry about me. Anything I did willingly, and you don't have to concern yourself about it. Her actions have been selfless. They've intended to be a blessing to Elisha. She didn't want anything in return. Why did she do that? Well, basically, we're told. She told her husband, he's a real man of God. He's the authentic, real deal. And he should have a place where he can rest and find comfort in his journeys, where he will be fed. And we can provide those things. Excuse me. So, obviously, a selfless and generous woman. So, Elisha questions Gehazi further, trying to figure out what they could possibly do for this woman. And Gehazi says, look, she doesn't have a son, and her husband is an old man. In the natural, she's not going to get a son. It's almost as if they're describing a woman who one day wanted a family, but has given up because over an extended period of time, it just did not happen. Did you notice that in all of these interactions, she calls him a man of God, man of God, man of God? So she's not being disrespectful. She simply does not want her hopes elevated only to be disappointed again. So Elisha didn't argue with her. He didn't try to convince her it would happen. There was no long debate over his statement that she would have a child in about a year's time. But guess what? Whether there was something Scripture didn't record or it just didn't ever happen, about that time the next year, not only had she conceived, but she had borne a son, just as Elisha had said that she would. And that adds her to the list of women to whom God had miraculously given children. We know that Sarai became Sarah because she became mother to Isaac, her miracle son. We know that Rachel had Joseph, unfortunately died, giving birth to Benjamin, but still God gave her miracle children. We know that Hannah prayed for a son, and God gave her Samuel, and she promised to give Samuel back to God. But God blessed her, and she had 3 sons and 2 daughters after that. We know that he also gave this gracious and hospitable woman a son. Now, in part 2, God allows this faithful, benevolent, generous and kind woman to be tested, sorely tested. Now, we don't like it that God allows people who are righteous to the degree, we know that our righteousness is filthy rags, but we also know that we have received the righteousness of Jesus Christ. So he allows this woman who does not yet have an opportunity to know Christ, but is living under the law, doing the best she can, and he allows her to be sorely tested. I remind you of Job. The first couple of chapters of Job are not exactly gentle reading. I mean, God clearly allowed Job to be very, very sorely tested. So God allows that testing process for the purpose of producing desired results in us, for the purpose of showing Himself strong, for the purpose of maturing us and stretching us, for the purpose of allowing other people to see His work in our lives, for the purpose of allowing us to keep the right attitude and continue to worship God no matter what, so that other people can see that commitment in us. Well, now, I need to make a distinction here. I did not say that God sent testing. I said He allows difficulties. And allowing is not the same thing as causing. That's just not the same thing. God's purpose always is for His people to grow, for the gospel message to be spread, for people to learn to trust God even in the hard times, no matter what is in the future or faced. God wants us to recognize that He's with us in the middle of our trouble. He does not leave us there. We need to learn to sense His presence in our trouble, to recognize His love and provision for us even in our difficulty. I remind you that Psalm 25:10 says, "All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep His covenant and His testimonies." Romans 8:28, I know you know it, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. So this woman is about to go through the unthinkable. All right, back to our text. Chapter 4, verses 18 through 28. When the child had grown, we don't know how grown. We do not know how old this child is. He went out one day to his father among the reapers. And he said to his father, "Oh, my head, my head." The father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother." And when he had lifted him and brought him to his mother, the child sat on her lap till noon. Well, he's not a big teenager, or he wouldn't be sitting on her lap. And then he died, and she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. Now, he's not too big for her to carry. Did you notice that? So we don't know how old that is, but she can move him up the stairs and to the bed of the man of God. Then she called to her husband and said, "Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again." And he said, "Why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath." She said, "All is well." Then she saddled the donkey, and she said to her servant, "Urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you." So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi his servant, "Look, there is the Shunammite. But run at once to meet her and say to her, 'Is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child?' And she answered, 'All is well.' And when she came to the mountain to the man of God, she caught hold of his feet, and Gehazi came to push her away. But the man of God said, 'Leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me, and has not told me.' Then she said, 'Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, do not deceive me?'" Now, it's harvest time. That means it's hot. It's the hottest time of the year. Again, we don't know how old this child is. Old enough to follow his father to the fields, but not so old that his mother can't carry him. Scripture does not tell us physically what happened to him. We don't have a diagnosis. We are told that he indicates that there's a problem with his head. From that, my head, we presume his head hurts. Most Bible scholars believe this child had a heat stroke and that it could have caused brain inflammation sufficient that he would have felt those symptoms and uttered that pain in that kind of distress. Now, I looked it up because I wanted to know how you would feel if you were having a heat stroke and what damage it would do to your body. According to the Mayo Clinic, symptoms of a heat stroke include high body temperature, the core might be 104 or above, altered mental state or behavior, meaning you might do something out of character or not quite be in touch with reality with what you say. Alteration in sweating, they will stop sweating because they're dehydrated. Nausea, vomiting, flushed skin, rapid breathing, racing heart rate, throbbing headache. That kind of heat stroke is the most severe sun damage a person can have. What does that do to your body? When there is no timely emergency treatment, then the brain can be impacted, as well as the heart, the kidneys, and the muscles. The longer treatment is delayed, the more the damage worsens to the point of it killing the victim. So in this case, we've got a child who would dehydrate faster than an adult would. He cries out. The father says, "Take this child to his mother." The servant does that. He sits in her lap, but I can empathize with her. What are the chances that she knew exactly what to do? What are the chances that she had the means? When you're hot like that, you need to be cooled down, you need to be hydrated. What are the chances that she had the means to even do that? We've all been in that position to where we didn't know what to do and maybe didn't have the means to do, even if we had an inkling of what to do. Obviously, she loved her son, loved him passionately, loved him with utter devotion, but didn't know how to help him or didn't have the means to help him. Now, when she realizes that he's dead, she takes this child upstairs to place him on the prophet's bed in his room, the room she built for that prophet. And she leaves that child on that bed and shuts the door. Now, what on earth is she doing? I mean, she has put him on a bed. He's dead. In a room that she built for a prophet, but the prophet's not there. Shutting the door and putting that child in the room of that prophet seems to indicate that she is putting her faith and trust in this prophet, this man of God, this person that she calls man of God all the time, and in the God before whom he stands. Remember, Elijah referred to himself that way, and Elisha has also, the God before whom I stand. So she doesn't trust anything or anyone with the outcome of this situation but Elisha, the man of God. Now, we know that he's called man of God over and over and over again by people from all walks of life. he's actually referred to as man of God 6 times in chapter 4 alone. Verse 9, 16, 22, 25, 27, and 40. But we will not leave that designation once we leave chapter 4. It occurs again in chapter 5, verse 8, chapter 6, verse 6, chapter 9, verses 9 and 10 of chapter 6, chapter 7, verse 18, chapter 8, verses 4, 8, and 11, over and over again, we see that occur. Now, Elisha deserved that designation. You're going to go, well, what made him special? I'll tell you what made him special. He was sold out to God. He spoke God's truth. He stood for truth. He stood against Baal worshipers, even if it meant standing in bad circumstances. He was a man committed to speak the truth of God. He lived a life of faithful devotion to God. He served God to the best of his ability. He was grieved at the sins of his people. He stood against wrong and for right. He spoke for God and did it with authority. And God validated his prophet and the ministry of his prophet with miracles, signs, and wonders. Now, we know the world standards are totally different. Are you rich? Are you famous? Are you intelligent? Are you recognized? Who and what are you by our standards? But see, being called a man or a woman of God is the highest level of praise in God's kingdom. It's the highest kind of compliment a person could get. That was true for Elisha. It's still true today. Now, okay, this woman's husband doesn't understand. Why are you wanting to go to the prophet today? It's not a new moon. It's not a Sabbath. We are not expected to offer a sacrifice. It's not a day when we need to go to the synagogue. None of that. None of that. In fact, he's like, I don't know why you would go. There's no reason to go. And she says, it is well. Some versions say all is well. And the King James Version says it shall be well. I actually like that. So she doesn't want him to worry. She's careful about that. She's concerned that he not fret. The word she uses speaking to him in the Hebrew suggests the idea of peace. She just wants him to be at peace because she is functioning in faith. You understand that reality says her son is dead, and now the minutes are ticking as to how long he's been dead. She doesn't want her husband to worry. The prophet is her only source of help. She thinks she has to get to the man of God. She's not speaking reality. She's speaking faith. She asks for one of the donkeys. Now, there's a pretty good chance. She says, send me I need one of those donkeys, and I need a servant. There probably were only two. Even the way it's phrased kind of indicates there were only 2 donkeys. And you know and I know that those donkeys were being used gathering the crops for the harvest. Okay, so she's just slowed the harvest down, but he sends her the donkey, though he does not really understand what she is doing. Now, we don't know exactly how she knows where to find Elisha. We have to assume that either his circuits were predictable, or perhaps the last time he had passed through, he had given her a kind of itinerary. I don't know. But she seemed to know exactly where he was because she didn't spend time wandering around looking for him. She headed off for Mount Carmel because that's where the prophet was. But we need to get some more facts to understand exactly what is going on. Do you know that from Shunem to Mount Carmel, it was over 20 miles. So this woman just got on the back of a donkey and told the servant that's going with her, okay, speed up and do not slow down for anything unless I just tell you that you have to slow down for a minute. Let's get going. She's about to ride 20 miles, well, actually it's over 20 miles, on the back of a donkey to get to a prophet that she views as her only hope. Now, Elisha sees her from afar when she's approaching and says to his servant, hey, that's that Shunammite woman. Run out there and make sure everything's okay with her and her husband and the child. So Gehazi goes and he asks her, is everything okay? And she says, all is well. Now, clearly, she is not going into this story with anyone other than the man of God. She is not going to waste her time telling exactly what's going on to Gehazi. She is not going to settle for anything other than God's man. So she approaches the prophet, and when she gets there, by now she is full up to here. She has held it in as long as she can. She grabs his feet, and she is obviously distressed. Well, Gehazi makes a move to remove her, to get her away from the prophet. And he's like, and Elisha says, no, don't touch her. Can't you see she's distressed? This woman is distraught. In other words, in his compassion for her, Elisha was giving her time to get some of that out and get herself under control a little bit so that she could talk to him about what even is going on. Okay. Now, her soul's in distress. Finally, she's where she can start talking to the prophet. Here's what's interesting. Elisha says, she's in distress, don't touch her. And then he adds, and the Lord, something's going on, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. Now, this is not some indication that God is deliberately keeping Elisha in the dark or not going to reveal anything to his prophet. It's simply an indication that God hasn't revealed anything to him and that Elisha does not know this child is dead. He does not. He does not know it. And so, did God ever reveal things in advance to him? I think occasionally, but what if I told you that's not necessarily the norm? Those prophets were to handle things in season and out of season. Now, you may remember that God told Elijah not to be afraid to go with the third captain and his 50. He said, I'll go with you. Don't be afraid to go. It's going to be all right. He told Elisha not to be afraid during the famine, that he was going to feed him and give him water and that he would be cared for. So yes, sometimes God told them, but not always. They had to do the same things we do, function and walk by faith in the degree of revelation that God has given, no more and no less. So once the woman is at herself enough to talk, she reminds Elisha, she says, did I ask you for a son? I didn't ask you for a son. And didn't I say to you, don't deceive me? She's not being disrespectful. She's again expressing the depth of her anguish, of her grief, of her pain. Oh. Now, God is about to show himself powerful, but this woman has to walk through that testing period before the revelation of God's power comes. Now, I remind you, how far did she go to get to Elisha? Over 20 miles. What time of day is it? Well, the child went out with his father. His father sent him back by a servant, and he died when? About noon. Okay, it's somewhere in the afternoon, and that only allows for the fact that she pushed herself. And that servant, wherever he is probably exhausted because they have covered some territory. Okay, So here we are. Elisha is going to give some instructions, and they begin in verse 29. I'll read from verse 29 through verse 37. Then he, Elisha, said to Gehazi, "Get yourself ready and take my staff in your hand and be on your way. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. If anyone greets you, do not answer him, but lay my staff on the face of the child." And the mother of the child said, "As the Lord lives and as your soul lives, I will not leave you." So he arose and followed her. Now Gehazi went on ahead of them and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was neither voice nor hearing. Therefore he went back to meet Elisha, and told him, saying, "The child has not awakened." When Elisha came into the house, there was the child lying dead on his bed. He went in, therefore, shut the door behind the two of them, and prayed to the Lord. And he went up and lay on the child, and put his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself out on the child, and the flesh of the child became warm. He returned and walked about, back and forth in the house, and again went up and stretched himself out on him. Then the child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes, and he called Gehazi and said, "Call this Shunammite woman." So he called her, and when she came in to him, he said, "Pick up your son." So she went in, fell at his feet, and bowed to the ground. Then she picked up her son and went out. Now, Elisha obviously intends to send Gehazi as his representative, his deputy, his emissary, his something or other. And he tells Gehazi to take his staff, and when he gets to the boy, to lay the staff on the boy's face, and that the presumption then is that this child may respond to this staff being placed on him. Now, apparently the staff is to be a symbol of God's power. The idea being that if we have a heat stroke in progress, that maybe the heat stroke could stop the damage and restore health. Some Bible scholars even argue that Elisha probably didn't realize that the child is dead. Maybe not. I don't know about that. But if that's true, no wonder he walks into that room and he realizes this boy is dead. He sees him lying there. Okay, so Elisha intends for Gehazi to be his representative. Gehazi runs on ahead. He gets to this room, he places this staff on the child's face, and nothing happens. Not a thing. So he goes back out and meets Elisha as he approaches. And Elisha enters and sees the child there. And whether he realized it before or not, now he fully knows that this young man is deceased. Wonder what time it was by then. I mean, she went 20 miles after noon. She came back 20 miles sometime over in the afternoon. You do understand that's 40 miles in an afternoon. That's a lot of territory to cover. Okay, so Elisha sees this child, knows he's dead, and stretches out over this child's body, puts his mouth and his eyes on the child's mouth and eyes, puts his hands on the child's hands, and stretches his body out on this child. Now, when we studied Elijah, I said the same thing. Before you use that method to pray for someone, you better know that's God, because I could only imagine the result of doing that in the culture in which we live. So, okay, he stretches himself out on the child. The child starts to feel a little bit warm, But that may just be from Elijah lying on top of him. I don't know. And so he gets up and walks around. It almost seems to indicate that he goes back down to the house and walks around down there. I don't know whether that's accurate or just appears to be a combination of the close proximity. I'm not sure. But he's walking around. He's obviously anxious. He's distressed. He wants this young man raised. He has already talked to God. Actually, it's very important for us to understand that. Now, we know that he knows the story of Elijah and the boy that he was raising from the dead. We know he knows that story. So much of what Elijah prayed is actually recorded for us. So Elisha is going to follow the pattern of his mentor to a T, and that's found in 1 Kings 17, verses 17 through 20. Now it happened after these things that the son of the woman who owned the house became sick, and his sickness was so serious that there was no breath left in him. So she said to Elijah, "What have I to do with you, O man of God?" There's that term again. "Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" And he went to her, "Give me your son." So he took him out of her arms and carried him to the upper room where he was staying and laid him on his own bed. That he cried out to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy to the widow with whom I lodge by killing her son?" Okay. So he cried out what? To the Lord. "O Lord my God, have you brought tragedy to the widow with whom I lodge by killing her son?" So Elijah cried out to God. Elisha crawls out to God, stretches out on this child. He feels a little warm, but he's not alive. He's distressed, he's anxious, he's functioning in faith. He wants this child restored. He gets up and he's walking around. Exactly how far he went, we don't know, and I'm not going to debate that point. The Shunammite woman showed her faith when she told her husband, "It shall be well." Then she told Gehazi, "It is well." She's been functioning in faith, going for the man of God when she knows good and well this child is dead. Now Elijah is not only showing faith, but showing great perseverance and persistence. He stretches himself back on that child again, stretching out over him, mouth to mouth, nose to nose, hands to hands, willing by the power of God within him that child back to life. I remind you of 1 Kings 17, verses 21 through 24. And Elijah stretched himself out on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord and said, "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper room and into the house and gave him to his mother. And Elijah said, "Son, see, your son is here." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord is in your mouth." So Elijah stretched out on the child 3 times. Elisha stretched out twice. Elijah prayed before he did anything else. Elisha prayed before he did anything else. And now the faith that's being exercised is the faith of the Shunammite woman and the faith of Elisha. he is actually functioning in pure faith. God, I believe you're going to restore this child, and I want to see him restored. And God heard that prayer. Now, notice, Elisha stretched out on the child twice. Elijah stretched out on the child 3 times. Remember, Elisha has a double portion of God's Spirit resting upon him. So he sneezes. You remember that there was no sound, nothing that came out the first time. He was just there. But now we have a young man who is sneezing and making noise. And Elisha says, go call his mother. Now, Elijah took the boy to his mother. Elisha calls the mother to the boy and basically says, look, I have her come to me. He's going to be all right, but you bring her to me. And so the mother was brought in before Elisha. It takes one look exactly to know that this boy that she loves so dearly is still alive. And so she is, oh my word, overwhelmed. And she again is on the floor before Elisha. Now, I don't want to lead you astray here so that you think she's worshiping this man. She's not worshiping him, but she's overwhelmed with awe and gratitude to God for what he has done for her. In that case, she then turns and picks up her son, prepared to take him out of the prophet's room. Now, we know that she's been in a test in the dark season of her life. But here's what this story proves. In the test, there will come forth a testimony, because God has the best interest of his people at heart. And he may let us go through trials in order to test us and to prove our worth. But he loves us, and he intends good to come to us from that testing that we have been through. So we can thank God for his incredible blessings, the blessings he pours out on those who love him and serve him. Psalm 4:3 says, we know that the Lord has set apart for himself him who is godly, that with all those who all do not know him do not receive his blessings, but are under the curse of their sins. Wow. Psalm 25:10. All the paths of the Lord are mercy and truth, to such as keep his command and his testimony. Psalm 34:4. I sought the Lord, and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. So let me get this right. That the Lord has set apart those who are godly for himself, and those people, he will be near them when they call. The paths of the Lord that he wants us to walk are mercy and truth, and he has a covenant relationship with those who are faithful to him. He goes further, because when we seek him, he hears us, and the psalmist tells us he answers us. People who are not in right relationship with God do not have that kind of guarantee at all. Wow. Thank God for the blessings he bestows on those of us who are doing our very best to be faithful to him, to trust him, especially in trying times, because he is near the brokenhearted. He is with those that are struggling in trying and difficult times, and he immediately is at the call of those who are near to him and calling out to him. Wicked people don't have that promise. Now, when we see Elisha next, he has returned to the village of Gilgal, and it's one of the locations he visits, mentoring the sons of the prophets. He's probably making another one of those circuitous routes. He is approaching Gilgal. Remember that the sons of the prophets are prone to build structures that are large enough for all of them, so a bunch of them would be nearby. I'll get it out. I can't talk today. And so he's on his way to minister to these young men and to take care of their needs. Now, mostly in the stories of Elisha and Elijah do we see that term, sons of the prophets. After you get out of 1st and 2nd Kings, you don't see that anymore. So next time when we come back, we're going to see not one example, but 2 examples of how Elisha was used mightily to minister to the sons of the prophets. And in the meantime, I pray you will remember that God is with you no matter what situation you are in, and He will not only be with you, He will minister to you in the middle of the mess. So until I see you next time, focus on Him. Remember His goodness. God is good all the time. God bless.